All right, I think we can get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Greta Zaro with World Beyond War. I'm excited to be joining you today. Some tech logistics. We are recording this webinar and we will send out the recording afterwards. We also have the closed captioning on. If you need closed captions, you can click on the CC button at the bottom of your screen to enable the captions. You can also click that button if you want to disable the captions from there. And with that, I will turn it over to Barry Sweeney, who is the chapter coordinator for the Irish chapter of World Beyond War.
Very good. Thank you, Greta. And hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you very much for coming. It's great to see so many people here today for the first of this series of 5 webinars. The series is titled Bearing Witness to the Realities and Consequences of War. Our guests today are Niamh Bhriain and Nick Buxton, and they are being interviewed by Eamon Rafter, a member of World Beyond War Ireland. Niamh and Nick both work for the Transnational Institute, TNI, which is an international research and advocacy institute committed to building a just, democratic and sustainable world. TNI has a reputation for well-researched analysis on key global issues long before they become mainstream concerns. And I, for one, am certainly looking forward to seeing where today's conversation goes. After the conversation, then we're going to have a respondent to the conversation who will give us his thoughts, what it made him think, realize, feel. So just a few minutes of a response to the conversation. Then undoubtedly we will all learn many things through today's conversation. So if at any stage you have any questions or you would like anything clarified, put your questions or comments in the chat area and we will read out the questions to Niamh and Nick in the question and answers section at the end. So without further delay, here are Eamon Rafter, Niamh Bhriain and Nick Buxton.
Good evening, everyone. Great to be here, and it's great to have Nick and Niamh with us this evening. Looking forward to a fascinating conversation. We will this evening start off our series by exploring lives lived in an increasingly walled world. That seems to be the way things are heading. Who are the winners in this, and of course who's losing through this process. We'll also kind of maybe have some time to explore how the concept of security itself has been co-opted to mean state security, or a militarized version of security, which I think in World Beyond War, we would say makes everyone less safe as this process advances. So let's start off then, and we're going to hear now from our guests. And I want to start by coming to Niamh. Niamh, Barry mentioned TNI, the Transnational Institute, in his introduction. Maybe you could give us a little bit of background on TNI, where it came from, how it emerged, and maybe say something about the War and Pacification Program that you head up, and very interested in your usage of that word pacification and what it means in the context of your work. So Niamh.
Okay, thanks very much, Eamon, and thanks everyone for inviting us to speak this evening. It's very exciting to be part of this conversation. Yeah, so I suppose first of all, to explain a little bit about the Transnational Institute, TNI. So TNI is a research critical thinking institute which is based in Amsterdam. We have been doing the work we're doing for almost 50 years. The Institute was founded in the 1970s, and it was founded very much as a safe space for critical thinkers who were, for whatever reason, being persecuted, politically persecuted in the countries or regions where they were based. Many of them couldn't speak freely, and many of them were forced to flee wherever they were, and found a safe space in Europe in the 1970s, and in particular in Amsterdam. And so TNI kind of evolved from a situation where free-thinking, left-leaning political figures and activists and human rights defenders and movements congregated in Amsterdam and formed the Transnational Institute. And from very early on, our foundings were very much linked to Chile. And we had Orlando Letelier, who was the ambassador in Washington to Allende's government, he was actually assassinated while he was with TNI as our second director. He was very much involved from the very beginning, and because of that, we had very much kind of Latin American influence very early on in the Transnational Institute, and we tried to continue that. And of course, we've been very excited to see the movements in Chile in the last few months and over the last year or so, which I suppose in a way from Transnational Institute bring us back to our roots as well. So so I suppose Critical Thinking Research Institute based in Amsterdam. A lot of the work that we do is around human rights and social justice questions, and we have a number of programs. So some of the programs are linked to, for example, corporate power, public alternatives, agrarian environmental justice. We've got a number of different focuses, but the focus that we're discussing tonight is, of course, the War and Pacification Program. So the War and Pacification Program evolved from what was a dormant peace and security program. The peace and security program very much focused on kind of the area of US military bases, kind of post declaration of the war on terror. For various reasons, that program became dormant. And then when we reactivated what was the Peace and Security Program in 2016, we felt that in many ways the world in 2016 was a very different place to what it had been when we initially kind of started out the work that we had been doing, and that war and pacification was a more reflective term of where the world was at. And I suppose war is it's quite self-explanatory, I suppose, the term war, but pacification was very much this idea that even if you're not in high intensity conflict, like for example, Afghanistan and Iraq, which were the kind of conflicts that had been evolving as the program went on, but even if you're not in high level intensity conflict, pacification is all around us, and it can be as subtle as the population being in debt, for example. So it's this idea that we're all obedient, that we're all subservient to the system, that we're all pacified, and the pacification may come through policing, but it may also come from the debt system, for example, the way the banking system behaves kind of after the crash in 2008. So it's kind of this idea that you're keeping the population under control, be it through policing, be it through, the system as it were needs this kind of pacified population in order for the wheels of capitalism to turn. So I don't know if that if that explains what we're talking about when we say pacification, but that's more or less our understanding of it.
Yeah, that's really helpful to kind of to lead us into talking about this walled world that we're living in, with securitized borders and people defined as a threat who are kept out, and perhaps a more privileged group of people who convince themselves they're more secure if this threat is behind a wall. So, I mean, how did we get to the point, or how did we arrive at this stage, I suppose, over the last number of years, maybe up to 30 years, where we're living in this walled world? I mean, how what were the stages of development of this process?
So I think the idea of a threat is very important. And I think just to take us back again to kind of the origins of TNI and maybe even before that, there has to be a concept of a threat in order to justify a militarized response. So the threat, after World War II, the threat is the threat of communism. Then we see the threat of drugs, and in TNI we have a drugs program. So we see, first of all, the threat of communism. Then we see this kind of threat of, drugs, and the war on drugs is declared. Then things move on and we see the war on terror being declared. And so we constantly see this idea that there has to be a threat, and that existence of this threat that's manufactured justifies then this militarized response or this securitized response. And so I suppose just thinking in terms of the last 30 years or so, which is often the kind of date that we focus on, because of course it's significant in terms of walls when we think of the Berlin Wall coming down in just over 30 years ago. And I suppose when you think of in the 1980s, we have a move within Europe to kind of build a more integrated Europe where people can move more freely within Europe's borders. So we have, the signing of the Schengen agreement, where borders within Europe are basically deconstructed. You can move usually from one state to the next. Of course, we've seen lots of variations of that, particularly during COVID-19. But for the most part, the idea was that Schengen opens up movement within Europe. But then what we see beyond that is actually a wall being built around Europe, which has been constructed in different shapes and forms. In TNI, we often speak about physical walls, maritime walls, and increasingly virtual walls. But just to give an example, because we often think of this as something that has always been the case, that Europe has always been walled off. But at the end of 2019, I traveled to Tunisia for a gathering there on borders, and many of the people who were there said that they regularly would have traveled from Tunisia to Italy on a boat. It was an activity that you would go for a long weekend to the south of Italy and come back at the end of the summer. Whereas as Schengen opened up movement within Europe, movement towards Europe from outside became increasingly difficult, and this idea that we needed to build a fortress up around ourselves. We saw after the Arab Spring, so in 2011, for example, we saw that after the Arab Spring, and again in 2015, we had movements within Brussels that were advocating for more and more infrastructure to be built around Europe, and this idea that we're protecting Europe from, often the narrative is we're protecting Europe from smugglers, we're protecting Europe from potential terrorists. And recently we've seen with the Belarus-Polish border, we have seen that the narrative has moved not just from discussing threats and securitization, but really a narrative of war. And we see that there's increasingly this move almost towards a war on migrants, a war on people on the move, a war on refugees. The vast majority of people on the Polish-Belarusian border are from Iraq, they're from Afghanistan, countries where we know that there are wars taking place. So we have this concept that they are a threat to Europe being built up and that walls are being built, but walls will not resolve this situation. They will just push people to take more dangerous routes. The European Union is basically pushing for a policy of deterrence and containment, which history has shown us, and recent experience has shown us that will not work. It will just push people to take more dangerous routes. So sorry if I extended myself a bit longer, Eamon, but just to kind of discuss a little bit how we got to here. There's been kind of I haven't discussed anything about the corporate side of things, but maybe Nick will come in on that. But
so thanks. Yeah, that's great, Niamh, to kind of set up our where we kind of are now at some level. And maybe Nick, if I could come to you now. Niamh has referred to these multiple threats. And I mean, what political agenda and corporate agenda are driving these sort of arguments that we're all under threat and we need to protect and defend ourselves? And you in your book, The Secure and the Dispossessed, I think you kind of highlight this notion that the winners and losers in this process. So could you say a little more about what is the agenda that's driving this whole securitization process?
Yeah, I was thinking just before, I read a story today which I thought was very relevant to kind of unpack a bit and follow on from what Niamh was saying. It was the Arizona Attorney General last week, and it also links really to this story about war and walls, because I see the wall economy is very much linked to the war economy. And that's why I think this is really relevant to the discussion and also to the movement of world beyond war, because really it is a movement also of a world beyond walls. And this story is that the Arizona Attorney General, a Republican, has just issued a legal statement saying that the people crossing the border, and we're talking about those who are managed to get across the US-Mexico border in small numbers, it constitutes an invasion, he said. And therefore, it allows the Arizona governor to acclaim war powers in order to deal with this invasion. And I just thought that was fascinating and disturbing at the same time, because here is a war rhetoric being used against some of the most vulnerable people in the world and being justified to kind of mobilize the whole apparatus of war and military and security. But I think it points to a kind of deeper truth that's underlying this, which is that we have had the building up of the two sectors of the economy, which have really massively grown, particularly since the end of the Cold War, has been military budgets. They kind of dipped very slightly, but as we know, and as everyone on this call knows and involved in peace activism knows, it has expanded and almost more than doubled since the 1990s. And at the same time, we have a security economy that has kind of emerged, all promising security. And these two things are both interconnected and intersecting, and sometimes even the same industries. So as Niamh was talking about, we're finding new wars. It's not about nation states anymore. It's about drugs. It can be about terrorism. Well, not even terrorism, it was terror. You had a war on terror and a war on a kind of an adjective. And we see that particularly now really being turned towards some of the most vulnerable people on the planet, those who are forced and to be displaced. And so we've started, as we started to look at this, we have unpacked that a lot of these there's kind of whole different sectors of the kind of the wall economy, which first of all include the arms firms. So much of the arms firms have diversified into providing some of the infrastructure for borders. So Lockheed Martin, Elbit, an Israeli firm, are kind of key to the US border infrastructure, providing the drones, also the kind of the radar systems, the night cameras and everything else that control borders. And then you have a whole bunch of firms that have emerged in terms of the biometrics, fingerprinting, eye scanning, that build in the big databases like EU LISA in the EU, which kind of track everyone as soon as you cross the border and then as you move through states. And then you have the whole industries that also kind of support that, whether that's some of the IT firms, IBM, and then the advisory firms. And this is where it has a relevance to Ireland particularly. So one of the biggest firms, which is headquarters in Ireland, is Accenture, that provides a lot of the advisory and the consultancy and the information architecture for much of this industry. And what we found is that this industry is both profiting from it, but also driving some of these trends. The whole idea of Frontex, which is now a border agency, which has expanded by something like 8,000% since 2005. It's become huge. It's now got its own it's going to become one of the biggest security forces in Europe, a European security force, and is expected to have something like 5.6 billion in its budgets by 2027. was actually proposed by the European Organization on Security, which is made up of Thales, Leonardo, some of the big arms firms. So they propose that what Europe needed at that point was a Coast Guard and border agency. And eventually what they propose becomes policy. And we have a really perverse thing that now that the companies who are driving these things are also profiting from it. And the cycle even gets a bit more perverse, that some of the arms firms selling to the Middle East and North Africa, which is causing displacement, then win the contracts of people as they flee that displacement. And we've been tracking some of that, which we can talk about later, how these firms actually are kind of really both structuring violence and then winning and profiting from that violence as well. And of course, underlying all of this is what this whole thing feeds off is, and this relates to Niamh's earlier points about pacification. It all feeds off a neoliberal system which has really made the world deeply unequal. And there's two ways of dealing with that. We can actually deal with the causes of that inequality and that injustice, or we can militarize the consequences. And that was very much what we were looking at in the book, The Secure and Dispossessed, how we had created a world where we were securing the rich and dispossessing and turning the poor into the threats that we need to be dealt with in a military manner.
Thanks, Nick. There's a lot there that we could unpack and talk about, but as you mentioned, that sort of perverse notion that the arms companies that are profiting from, if you like, the destruction of countries and forcing people into migration, and they're then doubly cashing in on keeping them out. I think, you know, perverse is certainly a word that we could use, and the fact that, you know, we in Ireland are now, you know, madly trying to get into the game, so to speak, with the Irish government actually supporting under the notion of, you know, enterprise, investment and jobs, companies to get involved in this whole, you know, surveillance and arms manufacture. But I mean, what kind of a world, I would like to ask you, are we kind of now creating for ourselves with all this, you know, perverse and dichotomous way of creating this security and dispossession? You know, what kind of a world have we got as a result of this?
Well, I think, yeah, I think the picture is really a disturbing and bleak one of where this is heading. I mean, if we did a report in 2018 where we looked at the number of walls that have been built across Europe since 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down. So there was a moment at the end of the Cold War where there was a sense that perhaps we could open up borders, that there was a sense of the divisions could be brought down, you know, that people power moment when people actually could pull down a wall that had divided a nation. And we discovered that by 2018, we had like the equivalent of 6 Berlin walls had been built, new ones had been built against migrants. I just working with one of the researchers in our team just the other day, looking just since 2018, that has doubled again. So that's in 4 years, we've gone now to 12 walls. That's really disturbing. And the direction of travel is really obvious. And what's important to realize is that those are the physical walls that we can see, and a lot of the walls are much less visible. So the most obvious wall is the Maritime War, which doesn't involve, in many cases, the wall, but basically we've created, as Niamh was saying, this kind of policy of containment, which is really deadly, because basically we've said that the Mediterranean can act as a kind of deliberate graveyard as a way of deterring people from traveling. And even the kind of rescue efforts that were being done about 10 years ago have gradually been just turned into surveillance operations now. They're not rescuing. Activists working in the Mediterranean are constantly sending, you can be on their tweets, it's really disturbing. They're constantly saying, here's a boat, it needs rescuing. And only a few times does it seem that it's actually rescued. but they can see the Frontex drones going over that are filming it. So it's not that they don't know, that the European officials don't know what's happening, but we're not investing the money now in the rescuing of people. Much more of it's going towards supporting, for example, the Libyan Navy to tow back the ships, if anything, back into often really appalling conditions, which have, in some cases been described as slavery. So it's to me it's a very disturbing picture. There's an African thinker who describes it as necropolitics. Basically, we just decided that it's a politics of death, that basically certain lives aren't worth as much as other lives, and that's the kind of politics that we're seeing unfolding. I think the other thing just I'd add here in terms of where it's going, because we can, I guess when it's not visible, people can kind of push it out of their mind. But what we also need to understand is that a border isn't just a line. It's not just on the physical frontiers. And so, for example, in the United States, they consider the border as being 100 miles inland of the thing, which means that in those places, the police, for example, they can search you without a warrant 100 miles inland because it's considered borderland. So a certain constitutional protection is removed from anyone, not just migrants, but anyone within that. And that actually happens in the US to be almost like 2/3 of the population. So these things ricochet effects because the bordering system is about control of movement, and that can extend beyond its initial target. And we've also been looking at this in terms of the way that the border has been expanded, not just inwards, but also outwards. So a lot of the EU now has an agreement with more than 35 countries across North Africa and Eastern Europe, which are all about them adopting border control and immigration control processes. And we are cooperating with some of the most authoritarian regimes on the planet, providing exactly the people who are responsible for repression, the security forces, with added resources, just because we want to stop migrants getting even near to the shores, let alone to the shores of Europe. So this is a picture that really our researchers just said we have to have a change, a fundamental change of direction, because it's unraveling. It's both unraveling our humanity, and where does it go? At what point do we say that this is enough, and that this is not a way of dealing with social and environmental crises?
Yeah, and then of course we have the whole notion of the extension of the borders into North African countries as well. Well, and again, that's a whole other process. I wonder, maybe Niamh, if you could say something about how the whole pandemic and COVID has impacted on this, notion of, again, building further barriers and creating different kinds of walls that divide and separate and create another group of non-people, if you like. How has COVID impacted on this picture?
Yeah, I suppose it has, as we all know, COVID has evolved continuously, but from very early on, we started to track what was happening, and we were seeing horrific situations where people who were arriving in the Mediterranean were being put on boats and being held. So, for example, Malta was putting migrants and refugees who were arriving by boat, putting them onto what would have been tourist ferries and just leaving them on the ferries, for example. Italy was also involved in the same thing. In the US, they evoked a law which had been on the statute books for many years, but hadn't been used, about returning people in the case of health situations. So you had people who were arriving to Europe or arriving to the US who had a legal right to seek asylum, were being turned away on the grounds that they presented a health threat. And instead of prioritizing, well, where is the risk coming from for these people? Can we try and accommodate them in situations where, if they are in fact carrying COVID-19, that they can be isolated or quarantined or whatever? We had a situation where they were immediately being pushed back. So you had a kind of, you had a legitimization or the legalizing of forced returns on the basis of COVID-19 being a grounds for pushing people out. Also, people who did manage to get inside the EU, for example, we know that in the camps in Greece, where the conditions are absolutely notorious in the camps in Greece, we had situations where people obviously couldn't socially distance because there's so much overcrowding in the camps. So even if they were inside Europe, the social distancing was absolutely impossible. Also in the camps, there is no access in many cases to water, to sanitation. So a lot of the measures that we were being told, so wash your hands, keep your distance, stay at home, those measures are absolutely impossible for people who if they do manage to make it into Europe, they probably can't apply those measures to how they go living their lives. And we saw that at home also in Ireland. We had in the direct provision centres where the cases were constantly on the rise because people are in horrific situations in the direct provision centres in Ireland. And they were the last to be thought of in the implementation of the COVID-19 policies at home. So we had situations where borders were being shut, people were just not being allowed travel. And now we have situations where people, for example, are not being allowed move because of vaccines. But we also have, we've seen, and even just at the moment, European Union and African Union are due to meet. The question of vaccination is on the table, and we've seen Europe hoarding vaccines. And not sharing them with Africa, for example, where there have been lots of calls for vaccines to be shared. And this is also being used as a way of keeping people out if they're not vaccinated, for example, instead of accommodating, again, other needs. So, yeah, you have a kind of the use of COVID as a pretext for doubling down on border policies that were already hugely problematic anyways, and they're being doubled down on under the COVID-19 guidelines. And it will be interesting now as we see Europe kind of moving out of the COVID-19 emergency that we've been living under for the last 2 or so years. It will be interesting to see which of the measures stick and what will continue to be in place and what will be derogated as we move out of the emergency. So yeah, it's one to keep watching as the pandemic has constantly evolved. It's definitely something to keep our eyes on.
Okay, so we've plenty of challenges to be dealing with in terms of all this, what we've been hearing about. However, I mean, I don't want to leave us in a completely, because we only have a couple of minutes to go, in a completely dark place. I am aware that TNI is also involved in the process of looking at other initiatives and other ways of doing security, or perhaps the initiatives around peace building and popular movements. Maybe I'll throw this open to either of you. What would you like to say? I mean, how could we maybe think about taking back security in the sense of a more humane or human version of security, to, if possible, roll back or really challenge this militarized and divided type of security that's been foisted on us. And maybe we can conclude our discussion this evening with some positive or some hopeful thoughts, because it is hugely challenging. So either or both of you, if you'd like to finish up with comments on a human security.
Maybe Nick, I'll just, because I just a point that I was thinking of as I was talking about COVID. I think that COVID has we've really been forced to look in the mirror and ask ourselves, what do we need to feel safe? And I think over the last 2 years, all of us have at some point come into, to really ask ourselves, what do I need to feel safe? And usually the answers are we need access to healthcare, we need access to housing, we need access to social services, we need access to education. Even before COVID, I remember the elections at home. Yeah, it seems like a lifetime ago, but the last general election at home, most of the most important issues that were on the table were housing and healthcare, and I think those issues are still there. But I think that 2 years on, after having gone through a global pandemic, I think we have never been more. I think the general public has never been more aware that there's something grossly wrong with the system that we are living in, that the capitalist system does not work for us. And I think that there has never been such a level of awareness across society that something is wrong and something is going in the wrong direction. I think the fact that we have that awareness, that the general population, I think, knows that we're going in the wrong direction. I think that's it's an opportunity to capitalize on that sense that something is wrong, and to mobilize and to push back. And we've seen lots of examples of that at home in different shapes and forms over the past number of years. And yeah, I think that it is a time when people are asking some really deep questions, I think, about how we can move the world to a better place. What do we need? I mean, I think just the basic question, what do you need to feel safe? The vast majority of people will probably say access to healthcare after the past 2 years that we've been through. I don't think they will say, tanks, bombs, guns, radar equipment, sensors, all of the money that, and just to mention a figure, because I'm working on a report at the moment on European Union spending. Between 2021 and 2027, the European Union will spend 8 billion on the European Defence Fund. By comparison, it will only spend 5.3 billion on the Health for All recovery from COVID package. So we're spending much less on health already. And we have to use the experience that we've just gone through to mobilize locally, nationally, across Europe, to push for a system that's for the people and not just serving the lucrative arms companies that Nick mentioned earlier. Capitalize on the moment and organize, like this webinar, for example, and similar activities. But I leave it at that, or I'll be out on the streets once we finish, and I'll get Nick to pick up from here.
Yeah, Nick, would you like to offer just a final last word on that around?
Yeah, I mean, I totally. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with Niamh that we have an opportunity right now, and I guess some practical pointers. I think it's really great that a World Beyond War is kind of broadening to look more widely at security, because I think one of the answers is joining our movements together. The climate movement with the peace movement, the whole Black Lives Matter with the peace movement, because these things are so interconnected and we've remained in silos too long, but with these issues cannot be separated. I just practically, I think these infrastructures, they seem all powerful, dominant, but they are made up of companies, and they're made up of companies in your town. And they're often made up of the same big companies like Accenture, which work on different contracts. So we have a way of actually starting to actually deconstruct the infrastructure by pointing out those things, by stopping certain contracts. If a city signs a contract with Accenture, we can say that's we don't want that, because they are investing in something which is causing deaths in the Mediterranean. So there's also opportunities here really for us to start to kind of target parts of the infrastructure and start to unravel it. And I think there's also a lot of power at local level. just today in Wales, for example, the British, we've got a racist immigration bill just going through Britain right now, but the Welsh government, as a result of a lot of campaigning here locally, stood out against it. So sometimes also there's a kind of potential really for kind of taking action locally or regionally, where we can start to advance a kind of different vision of what, as Niamh was saying, of what security, safety really looks like for ordinary people. Which is completely opposite to a militarized one, which only serves the interests of a very rich few.
Yeah, so thanks a lot, Nick, and thanks, Niamh. The conversation has thrown up lots of stuff. I think we could talk a lot more, but we want to give time for our other participants to come to get some questions in. Thanks for being with us. Thanks for the conversation. I'm going to go now to Peadar to give a response to what Niamh and Nick have been saying. So Peadar, you're on. Peadar, you're muted.
Okay, I'm unmuted now.
Yeah.
Great. So first of all, thanks very much to Niamh and Nick for what was a real tour de force of conversation, and thanks, Eamon, as well, for the way in which you moderated it. I suppose, and I also want to thank TNI, by the way, for the work that you do, because those of us who are activists rely on really, really well-grounded, well-conducted research. And to have an organization, as outlined by you at the outset, Niamh, that's engaged in that very detailed, very rigorous research. And that then enables us, who are not full-time committed to this, to read, to learn, to be informed by it, and to conduct these kinds of conversations that we've just had. So I've used the research work that TNI has produced for many, many years now, particularly your Drugs and Democracy program. And I just want to say thanks and well done, and long may that continue. Getting back to the substance of the conversation then, and I suppose notwithstanding, Eamon, that you not wanting us to leave in a dark place, I mean, I was really struck, Nick, by your observations that we are actually living in a disturbing and bleak period, and also notwithstanding as well the kind of grounds for optimism, or the seeds of optimism that you've pointed out in terms of capacity of people to challenge that, to challenge the norms that currently exist, and as Niamh has outlined, are grounded in kind of neoliberal economics. At the very beginning, Eamon, you referenced the fact that essentially this conversation is about lives lived in an increasingly walled world. And then there was reference to the fact that our lives are lived in an increasingly policed world. And I was very struck by the comments in the chat where our colleague Ed Horgan, who's very well established and very well known peace activist, was in Shannon Airport this afternoon collecting relatives to visit his very ill wife, and he was detained by the police. And he's detained by the police in the context of, as he has been systematically outlining in various letters to newspapers and to us over the past number of weeks, the surge in troop numbers that are going through the Shannon Airport. And it's an extraordinary irony that in this democratic state of ours, there has been an obsession with a Russian ship 240 miles off the coast, southwest coast of Ireland, and no obsession and no comment really about the surge in numbers of well-armed US troops going through on civilian airlines. And that goes without comment. And a peace activist goes to the airport to collect family members, and he's detained. I mean, I think that is just outrageous. And I think I'm glad we have the opportunity, even in this conversation, to draw attention to that. I suppose going back as well to, and Niamh, I'm not timing myself, so cut the mic when you think I have reached my limit. I was struck, Nick, as well by your reference to what's happening in Arizona and they accruing war powers to themselves. So it's interesting at two levels. One, that a state can do that and not the federal authorities. My understanding was that the declaration of war within the United States is a remit purely of the federal government and not of the state government. But on the other hand, I'm not really surprised at that either, because the war mindset in the United States runs really, really deep. And a lot of the policies, even the positive initiatives like Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty, is couched in the terms of war. And then, of course, you've had the war on drugs from 1972, and you've had the war on terror and the war on want and so on. So I think the war mindset is much more in evidence now, but it has always been present. And I think the challenge is to try to see in which we can break that mindset or challenge that mindset or undermine that mindset. And that for me is some of the really good work that the World Beyond War does, because by its very nature, it's trying to construct a world that is not framed exclusively or purely by war. And also that notion of that the war nowadays is waged on vulnerable people, but to an extent that has always been the way. I'm really conscious of Brian Stevenson from the EJI project in the United States, and he said that African American people are outraged that the notion of the war on terror is something that happened post 2001. He said Black people in the United States, from the moment of their arrival in 1691, have had a war on terror waged against them. And you could argue that the very existence of the First World War and the fact that the governments of these monarchical and elite and disassociated powers from the real lives of people always presumed that vulnerable people would fight these wars. So I think the concept of vulnerability and war is certainly evident nowadays, but I also think it has been there as well. And I liked a lot as well, Niamh, what you were saying in terms of our understanding of war, that the context in which wars are taking place are within the kind of the neoliberal world, which has become the kind of the hallmark of the dominant economic model, certainly from the 1970s onwards. And I think that very often those of us involved in thinking about war and those of us involved in campaigning around the issue and increase in securitization, we very often don't make that linkage back to economics and back to that neoliberal ideology. And I just thought what you said, Niamh, on that was really, really helpful and a reminder of us, or to us, that we, in our understanding of war, that it's not a discrete issue, that it permeates all other aspects and all other policy aspects, and particularly economic policies. So I thought that was really interesting. The maritime walls, I thought, so the construct of the visible and the invisible walls, I thought was really interesting. And I just want to finish, at the risk of Eamon pulling the plug on me, I just want to finish with that, and I looked at it recently by coincidence when Ronald Reagan, and there was a lot of reference to the Berlin Wall coming down. So when Ronald Reagan was in Berlin in 1987, and he made that dramatic appeal, which was received with great acclaim when he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall." So you had a Republican president calling for the destruction of what was the most visible wall in Europe at the time. And it's an indication, I suppose, of the dramatic shift that has taken place within Republican politics in the United States, that now even a revered president within sort of the Republican tradition would not find a place in the kind of Republican politics of today, because they are, amongst others, the strongest advocates of the construction of walls. So with that, Eamon, if it's okay, I'll stop. I just thought the conversation was great. I'm really pleased you were here. I'm really delighted that we had the benefit of your insight. I'm also really pleased, Greta, that it's recorded, because I think it's the kind of conversation that we will revisit ourselves, and I hope other people who may not be here this evening to see it live will have an opportunity to hear it. So thank you both very much indeed.
Very good. Thank you, Badr. So just moving swiftly along to the question and answers section, we just have a few minutes, so I'll just pick a few questions out. A few things that were mentioned in the conversation seem to have struck nerves. In particular, the sort of intersectionality between housing problems, lack of investing in the healthcare systems, bridges, roads, etc., etc. There's a question here from Caroline. She thanks you both, thank Nick and Niamh for bravely standing up for human rights. We'll be less, the question is, how much is fear of climate change affecting decisions driving the global trend for fortifying borders?
Perhaps I should jump in on that, because we just did a bit of research just before COP26, where we were looking at really what we're calling the climate wall, because what we see is that this whole trend of prioritizing walls and prioritizing militarized solutions has led to in the richest countries spending twice as much on border enforcement as they are to providing climate finance. In some countries it's much more. So for example, the US spends 11 times as much on its borders as it does on providing climate finance to the poorest countries. And what's really happening is that climate change is becoming a new excuse, and it's been described as a security issue, to say that migrants because of climate change will become an increased threat, and therefore we need more of this infrastructure. And you'll hear arms companies saying that, you'll hear lots of military officials saying it. The NATO Secretary General was in COP26 saying that climate change and security are two sides of the same coin, and they're all arguing for more spending and more, so climate change is becoming the kind of the new vehicle for saying that we must do much more of this. And there's very much a narrative that climate change will lead to increased conflict, so therefore we need to build up our infrastructure for much further. So and the trouble is that there is some naivety, I would say, in the environmental movement when I hear military officials saying that climate change should be taken seriously. It's the security issue. People don't really ask the question, whose security are they talking about? Because when you read the national security strategies, they're very much about securing military assets, making sure the military can continue to operate. And they're very much about defending the richest nations. And then they turn migrants into threats. So they very much feed into this whole narrative. So it's an important question, and I think it's really important for us, just as a general rule, to say whenever we hear the word security, ask whose security they're talking about.
Very good, thank you, Nick. There's another question there mentioning the inhumanity of the situation of the detainment centers in Greece, around Europe, about how migrants are being dehumanized so that ordinary people don't feel horrified by what's happening, and they just somehow let it drift by. And apart from the dehumanizing, that's when it actually makes the news a little. Most of the time, this just isn't visible at all. You both mentioned like the stages of development to get us to this point. How could we work back through the stages? How could we humanize people again? How could we make these poor, suffering people visible to more of the population? Maybe Niamh, you could take this one.
Yeah, I think often the media is very useful for us to get our messaging out and to get our framing, but also the media can be our worst enemy sometimes, depending on how they depict something. And I mean, maybe just to mention that there is an awful lot of agency within migrant and refugee and asylum seeker groups, and that's true in Ireland. You have an awful lot of organising going on within direct provision centres, for example, where it's the asylum seekers themselves who are pushing back against what has been happening. And I think that a lot of the reason why direct provision is on the agenda is because of the organising within the direct provision centres. I think that I suppose the question, how do we kind of wind back from here? One of the pieces of research that we did looks at what's driving people from their homes. It was a report that we did called Smoking Guns, and it looks at the European arms companies and how they are selling arms to specific countries and how those arms are being used to then forcibly displace people from their homes. And those people, in seeking safety, often tend to move towards wherever they can find safety, which may tend to be Europe. So we looked, for example, at arms deals that went to the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, to Iraq, the Turkish-Syria border. Basically, what we saw was that, in a nutshell, Europe is exporting arms and people are displaced from their homes and they're forced to move towards Europe. So if we were to wind this back, this is a political choice that Europe is making in allowing these arms deals to take place, in allowing these arms licenses and exportation to continue, although it knows that these arms are being sent to conflict regions, to regions where there's authoritarian regimes in place. So if we were to somehow push the stop button and try and undo all of this, we need to really look at where European arms deals are going, where the arms trade is taking place, and what is the result of that. We started doing that very much in a forensic way in T&I, using open source intelligence to really track an arms deal that goes from A to B and what those arms have been used for. So we need to stop this happening from the very beginning of where displacement occurs, but also along the migrant pathways. We see that there's constant containment, deterrence, and then the walls that they come up against. So I suppose, there's different stages along the way. And just in terms of how do we bring humanity into this, I think we need to take initiative and also take our lead also from those who are already organizing. The Permanent People's Tribunal has done a lot of activity around migrant groups, refugee groups, asylum seekers who are already organizing within Europe to push back against the system. And at home, I mentioned some examples of that as well. And so that we often tend to think vulnerable people without agency, but these people are very much the forefront of the fight, and we need to recognize their agency and work alongside them, and not kind of talk about them as if they're kind of external to us, but really work as a collective and push through together, I think.
Very good. Okay. Thank you both so much for coming today. We should wrap up now. That's 8 o'clock and we like to do things on time. Yes, so thank you very much for coming and participating. That was absolutely wonderful. The video will be uploaded to YouTube, so it will be available for sharing for anyone who wasn't here. As we had a little glimpse today, the realities and consequences of war are, choose your adjective, I don't know, I'm left speechless most of the time. Next week, I believe we will also be left speechless again. We have Lara Marlowe as our guest, who's a long-standing war correspondent, and she will certainly open our eyes to what goes on, the realities of what goes on far from our doors. And just for finishing today, the World Beyond War Ireland group, we felt it would be appropriate just to finish after dealing with a heavy topic like this with a little moment's reflection. And we came across a Jack B. Yeats painting titled Grief, which we'd like to just share the screen with you, and you can take a moment to reflect on what you've heard, and then we'll see you all next week. Okay, so as I share the screen here, let me tell you. So this is Jack B. Yeats' most powerful expression of his abhorrence of war. It appears to originate from a sketch entitled "Let There Be No More War." At the center of the painting, an apocalyptic figure on horseback gestures aggressively in the foreground. An elderly man looks on at the blood that drips onto his hands, while a mother places her arm protectively around a small child.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next week.